I still remember the night Ethan Kessler, yes, that Ethan Kessler followed a woman into the dark. Some said it was suspicion. Others whispered obsession. But I call it the night everything changed. It begins, as most stories of consequence do, with something ordinary. The scrape of shoes on wet pavement. The faint hiss of rain dying out as the storm pulled away, leaving the city streets slick and glistening under the sodium glow of street lamps. I can still hear it if I close my eyes, the sharp rhythm of his footsteps echoing off glass and steel. Each step rang hollow, like the tick of a clock in an empty room. And somewhere ahead, moving with quiet certainty, was her, Mara Alvarez, a woman no one would have noticed if Ethan hadn't noticed first. She was a shadow inside the great machine of his empire, a cleaner paid to wipe down desks and empty trash cans after the last analyst or junior manager had gone home. But that night she wasn't just a cleaner. That night she was a question. And men like Ethan Kessler had never been able to resist questions that refused to answer themselves. Picture him then, the billionaire in his immaculate black coat, collar raised against the damp. A man used to boardrooms where silence bent beneath his voice, now reduced to a figure trailing behind someone who barely knew his name. His shadow stretched long and thin under the lamps, crossing over puddles that rippled like liquid glass. Each time his shoe struck the ground, I wonder if he realized how strange it looked, how strange he looked, stalking a woman through the half-empty streets like some restless predator. But perhaps the strangeness was part of it. Perhaps it had been too long since Ethan had felt the raw pulse of the unknown. Money has a way of suffocating mystery. When you own everything, when you can buy everything, there's very little left to chase. But that night he chased. Mara walked briskly, unaware of the man behind her. Her figure was slender, her uniform plain, a faded jacket, shoes that had seen too many years. She carried a small satchel slung across her shoulder, the strap digging into her coat as though the weight inside was heavier than it should have been. She didn't look back. Not once, and that was what first unsettled Ethan, because in the city, late at night, a lone woman on the street always looks back. That's what years of whispered warnings, headlines, and self-preservation teach you, but not her. Her pace was steady, her shoulders set as if she knew exactly where she was going and feared nothing along the way. Why? What did she know, or not know, that allowed her to move so fearlessly through the dark? It was that question, I think, that pushed Ethan deeper into the night. The city had emptied by then. Only the hum of distant traffic and the occasional hiss of a passing bus broke the stillness. Storefronts were shuttered, their neon signs dark. A dog barked once from some forgotten alley, sharp and lonely. Mara turned a corner, her satchel bouncing against her hip. Ethan hesitated before following, his breath visible in the chill air. And it was there, in that hesitation, that something shifted in him. He was not a man who hesitated. Not in acquisitions, not in mergers, not in love, not in war. His empire had been built on decisive strikes, quick calculations, and an almost ruthless ability to close a deal before the other side even knew they were at the table. But trailing her through the wet streets, he found himself at war with a thought. What am I doing? He could have turned back then. He could have dismissed the impulse as foolish curiosity, climbed into the waiting car he had dismissed earlier, and returned to the sterile comfort of his penthouse. But he didn't, because the truth, one he wouldn't admit even to himself, was that Ethan Kessler hadn't been curious in a very long time. The old man's voice cracks here, as though reliving the memory costs him something. Then he continues, "You see, I've studied men like Ethan. I've watched them climb and I've watched them fall. And I can tell you this, for all their power, their money, their influence, what they fear most is silence. Silence in the boardroom. Silence in the press. Silence in the hollow chambers of their own hearts when the lights go out and the audience is gone." And that night, as Ethan followed Mara Alvarez, he was chasing the sound that breaks silence, the sound of meaning. He just didn't know it yet. The road narrowed as she moved deeper into the old quarter of the city. The pavement grew uneven, cobblestones glistening where the rain had pooled. The street lamps here were fewer, their light dim, their bulbs flickering with the fatigue of decades. Mara's shadow slipped from one pool of light to the next, always just far enough ahead to remain untouchable. Ethan's shoes scuffed against the stone, and he slowed, careful not to let the echo carry too far. For the first time in years, he felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not exactly, but something close enough to it that he could no longer deny he was alive. She turned again, this time down a narrow side street that even the most seasoned cab driver might have missed. Ethan followed, his steps quieter now. The air smelled different here, less of rain and asphalt, more of damp brick and something metallic. Rust, maybe. Or blood. The buildings leaned inward, their upper floors crowding the street like old men hunched over secrets they had no intention of sharing. A broken sign creaked overhead. Somewhere inside, a radio murmured faintly before cutting off mid-sentence. Mara never paused. Her hand brushed against the strap of her satchel, adjusting it as though she carried something precious inside. Something that could not wait until morning. Now, let me pause here, because you might think you know where this is going. You might think Ethan was about to uncover an affair, or a betrayal, or perhaps some petty theft from his company's supplies. After all, what could a cleaning woman possibly hide from a man who owned half the skyline? But you'd be wrong, dead wrong. Because what Ethan Kessler found at the end of that road was not crime. It was purpose. And purpose, my friends, is far more dangerous than crime. The air grew colder as they reached the far end of the street. Mara stopped at a rusted metal door tucked between two derelict buildings. She glanced around, not with fear, not even with suspicion, but with the quiet alertness of someone accustomed to secrecy. Then she slipped inside. The door closed. Ethan froze. His pulse quickened, breath visible in ragged bursts. The street was silent again, save for the steady drip of rainwater from a gutter above. He should have turned back. He should have left her to whatever business she had behind that door. But he didn't, because men like Ethan Kessler don't turn back when they've come this far. They push forward. Always forward. The old man leans in closer now, his voice dropping to a whisper, as though the memory itself carries weight too heavy to speak aloud. And what he found at the end of that road, well, it was nothing like what he expected. I've always believed that if you want to understand a man, truly understand him, you have to go back to the beginning. Before the money, before the power, before the decisions that shaped nations or toppled companies, you have to look at the child. Because inside every powerful man there is still a boy. And often, that boy is crying. Ethan Kessler was no different. He was born into privilege, the kind of privilege that builds fences not to keep people out, but to keep the family's image in. His earliest memories weren't of toys or laughter, but of polished marble floors that echoed every step, of grand dining halls where chandeliers swung like frozen constellations, and of shoes always polished, always aligned by the door, because in the Kessler household, even shoes had discipline. Their estate was vast. Acres of rolling lawns clipped by gardeners who spoke only when spoken to. A lake that mirrored the sky so perfectly, it seemed like God himself had dropped a piece of heaven onto their property. But for all its beauty, it was not a home. At dinner, the table stretched so far Ethan once wondered if his father could even hear him from the other end. The silence wasn't comfortable. It wasn't the hush of a family that knew each other so well words weren't needed. Know this. Silence was a wall, reinforced nightly by the clink of silverware against porcelain. His mother sat there too, perfectly coiffed, perfectly dressed, perfectly still. She smiled when guests visited, her laughter soft and practiced, but when it was just the three of them, her warmth vanished like steam from cooling tea. She was present in body, absent in spirit. And his father, His father was the kind of man who believed emotions were debts that could never be repaid. So he never invested in them at all. It was during those years that Ethan learned what loneliness really meant. Not the loneliness of absence, but the loneliness of presence without connection. He had toys more than most children could imagine. Entire rooms filled with train sets, model planes, puzzles imported from Europe. But the toys were quiet, and the rooms echoed. And no one ever came to sit with him on the floor and build castles out of blocks or laugh when the train derailed. Birthdays were the worst. Gifts wrapped in glossy paper, piled higher than he was tall. Cakes baked by chefs with sugar spun into roses. Yet the faces that blew out the candles with him were stranger staff paid to clap, chauffeurs told to sing, tutors instructed to smile. His mother kissed his cheek. His father nodded, satisfied the boy had survived another year, and Ethan smiled back, because that was what was expected. But when the candles were gone, and the guests were gone, and the lights were out, the boy, who had everything, lay awake in his bed, feeling like he had nothing at all. There is one memory that clung to Ethan's ribs like marrow, that would follow him into every deal, every betrayal, every moment of power. He was 8 years old. His father had called him into the study, a room lined with ledgers and oil paintings of grim ancestors who all seemed to be watching, judging. On the desk lay a pile of papers, columns of numbers scrawled across them. His father leaned back in the leather chair, fingers steepled, eyes sharp as razors. "Do you know what this is, Ethan?" The boy shook his head. "This is the real world. Numbers, decisions, value. Everything in life, everything in business, comes down to this truth. People are either assets or liabilities. Never forget that." The words landed heavy, too heavy for a child's shoulders. But they sank deep. People are either assets or liabilities. At the time, Ethan didn't know what it meant. But he would learn. And once he learned, he never stopped believing it. From then on, Ethan began to see the world differently. When the gardener smiled and handed him a flower, Ethan wondered, asset or liability? When the chauffeur drove him to school and spoke of his sick daughter, Ethan thought, asset or liability? Even his own mother, who sat at the window staring at the horizon as though waiting for someone who never came, became a ledger entry in his young mind. Was she an asset, or had she already crossed into liability? And slowly, the boy's heart hardened. Not because he was cruel, but because he believed that was the only way to survive in a world his father had defined for him. Funny thing, isn't it? Sometimes the richest homes produce the poorest hearts. You'd think a boy surrounded by abundance would grow generous, but too often it's the opposite. Comfort without love becomes a kind of hunger you can never quite feed. Ethan Kessler, the billionaire you'll read about in papers, the man who built empires and dismantled rivals, started as nothing more than a boy holding a phrase like a lantern in the dark. People are either assets or liabilities. And that light, well, it led him places. Places of power, yes, but also places of shadows. The old man clears his throat, voice lowering, almost as if confessing. That lesson, that phrase carved into his bones, it shaped him, no doubt. But the thing about beliefs, my friend, is that sooner or later, the world tests them. And Ethan Kessler was about to learn that people are not numbers. They are not assets, not liabilities. They are something else entirely. And when that truth arrived, it shattered everything he thought he knew. There are moments in a man's life when the world he has so carefully arranged tilts, just slightly at first, so slightly you could convince yourself it's nothing. But then the tilt becomes a slide, and before you know it, the floor has given way beneath your feet. For Ethan Kessler, that first tilt began in his office. By then, Ethan was a king among men. His empire stretched across continents, finance, technology, real estate, industries built on numbers that moved faster than most people could think. To the outside world, he was a titan. To those inside his company, he was a presence that haunted every spreadsheet, every quarterly projection, every deal struck in his name. But even empires, Vast and glittering, have cracks dotted started small. A file misfiled. A ledger missing a page. Lights in the office still burning long after the last analyst had left. Little things, easy to explain away. But Ethan wasn't a man who believed in coincidence. He had built his empire on patterns, and when a pattern broke, he noticed. One evening, he sat alone in his corner office, the city sprawling beneath him in a galaxy of lights. The building was empty save for the hum of machines. He leaned back in his chair, reviewing the day's reports. And then he saw it. The numbers didn't add up. Not in a small way, not in the way of human error, but in a way that whispered deliberate. A portfolio drained just enough to avoid alarms. An account accessed at an hour no one should have been working. A trail so faint most would have missed it. But not Ethan. Not the boy who had grown into a man, haunted by a father's words. People are either assets or liabilities. Someone was bleeding his empire from the inside. Ethan turned to the security cameras. Rows of black and white feeds flickered on the monitor. Empty hallways. Silent elevators. The ghostly reflection of cleaning staff pushing carts. At first, nothing. Hours of footage, routine, mundane. And then movement. Subtle. A figure passing through a restricted floor after midnight. Too quick to identify, but deliberate. Not the careless drift of a night worker, but the purposeful glide of someone who knew where they were going. Ethan leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. He replayed the tape. There a shadow, slim and slight, moving with the precision of habit, and then a face. Blurred at the edge of the frame, Mara Alvarez, a cleaner. That was all she was supposed to be. 37 years old. Immigrant background, lived alone in a cramped apartment across town. No disciplinary record, no complaints. A quiet woman who arrived on time, did her work, and left without fuss. The kind of person no one noticed unless something was out of place. But Ethan noticed. He pulled her file. Read every word. Cross-checked her hours. Watched her movements on camera again and again. On the surface, she was harmless. Forgettable, invisible. But invisibility, Ethan thought, could be the perfect disguise. Weeks passed, and the irregularities grew. Accounts shifted. Documents disappeared. Ethan began to feel the itch of obsession. He started staying later, watching from behind glass as the office emptied, until only the night staff remained. And always, there was Mara. She worked quietly, her mop gliding across floors that reflected the city's lights. She never looked up at the cameras, never lingered where she shouldn't. But Ethan watched her all the same. One night, as the clock neared midnight, he saw it. Her bag. It was different, larger, heavier. She struggled slightly with the strap as she slung it across her shoulder. Not the careless swing of someone carrying a sweater or a lunchbox, but the taut pull of hidden weight. Ethan's jaw tightened. She slipped out the side exit. Not the front where the guards sat, but the narrow stairwell door, rarely used. And Ethan knew, in that moment, that the tilt had become a slide. Here's where I pause, because it's worth asking. What was Ethan Kessler in that moment? Was he the predator, a billionaire hunting a woman who had dared to trespass against his empire? Or was he, in some twisted way, the protector, the man willing to lift a finger for the first time in his life, to chase after someone who might threaten everything he had built? Even now, I cannot answer. Perhaps he couldn't either, but this much is certain. That night, Ethan rose from his chair, left the safety of his office, and followed her into the dark. The stairwell was cold, the walls stained with decades of use. His footsteps echoed, sharp against the concrete. Down flight after flight until the door banged softly behind him, and he stepped out into the city night. The air was damp, the pavement slick. Ahead, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, Mara Alvarez walked quickly, her bag heavy against her side. Ethan's heart hammered. He was not a man accustomed to chasing. Deals came to him, opportunities bent to his will. But now, every Step he took felt clumsy, raw. His polished shoes slapped against the wet ground, and he cursed their noise. She didn't look back. Not once. And maybe that was what pulled him deeper. Do you hear it? The echo of his shoes, the rustle of her coat, the breath between them. That was the sound of a life unraveling, and so the chase began. A man who had never lifted a finger, chasing a woman who had nothing to lose. I have told you before that. Ethan Kessler was not a man built for pursuit. His world had always come to him, contracts sliding across tables, rivals crawling to offer concessions, politicians whispering for his favor. But that night, in the dripping dark of the city, he became something else entirely, a shadow trailing another shadow. Mara Alvarez walked ahead, her steps quick, steady, sure. The strap of her heavy bag cut into her shoulder, and the lamplight carved her silhouette sharp against the wet pavement. She didn't look back. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Any other woman alone, past midnight in that part of the city, would have glanced over her shoulder once, twice, maybe a dozen times. But not her. Ethan's polished shoes tapped against the slick stones, loud to his own ears. He tried to soften his step, but the sound still echoed like a metronome. Of pursuit. His breath misted in the cold air, sharp, quick. The streets changed as he followed her. Gone were the skyscrapers of glass and steel, gone the orderly hum of wealth. The pavement grew cracked, the storefronts boarded, the neon signs buzzing weakly. Like tired eyes. Trash skittered across the alleys, blown by winds that smelled of rust and damp brick, and all the while, Ethan's mind spun. What is she doing? Why leave with a bag so heavy? Who waits at the end of this road? Every step deepened his suspicion. He pictured her slipping documents from locked drawers, copying files onto drives, selling them to some rival eager to carve away a slice of his empire. He imagined her seated in some dark cafe, handing papers to faceless men. It made sense, didn't it? After all, what else could explain the missing files, the strange movements, the anomalies buried in his accounts? Yet the longer he followed, the less sure he became. The streets narrowed. The city's shine gave way to forgotten neighborhoods, where lampposts leaned like drunks and shadows gathered in doorways. A dog barked somewhere, chained too tight. A siren wailed in the distance, swallowed quickly by silence. Mara turned left, then right, her pace never faltering. She knew this path, that much was clear. Ethan trailed farther back, pulling his coat tighter, his heartbeat drumming against his ribs for the first time in years, paranoid at him. He was used to being the watcher, the one who saw others. Now he wondered if he was seen. What if this was a trap? What if she led him into an alley where others waited, rivals who had finally found a way to make him bleed? The thought quickened his step, but no. There was no hesitation in her walk, no glances into corners, no signals to shadows. She moved like someone who had walked this road 100 times, like someone who belonged here. And Ethan? He did not belong. His coat was too fine, his shoes too polished, his very presence an intrusion in these broken streets. He felt it in the stares of the few who lingered in doorways, men with hollow eyes and cigarettes that burned like warning beacons. They saw him, even if Mara did not. The chase stretched on. One block bled into another, the city's decay growing. Deeper, thicker, heavier. Ethan's thoughts tangled. She must be selling something. Maybe not to rivals. Maybe to the desperate. Maybe to those who would pay in cash no accountant could trace. It would explain the bag. The weight. The secrecy. But another thought slid beneath the first, colder, quieter. What if it's something worse? He remembered her file. A woman alone, no family near, no attachments visible. People like that carried secrets. People like that always had another life. And Ethan had to know. Mara slowed. They had reached a street nearly swallowed by shadow, the lamps here long dead. Only a single bulb glowed in the distance, a weak halo of yellow above a sagging doorway. She stopped there, adjusted the strap of her bag, looked once to the side, not back, not toward him, but toward the street itself, scanning the silence. Then she slipped inside. The door closed behind her. Ethan stood frozen, his breath fogging the dark. His hand trembled slightly on the edge of his coat. He could turn back now. No one would know. No one would ask Doc, but men like Ethan Kessler did not turn back. He crossed the street. The bulb buzzed overhead as he pushed the door, and what he saw inside, well, that was the first crack in everything he thought he knew. The door groaned as Ethan pushed it open, releasing a stale breath of air that smelled faintly of dust, paper, and boiled coffee. He expected darkness, perhaps the silence of an abandoned space where secrets changed hands. Instead, he found warmth. Hall was dimly lit, its walls cracked and yellowed with age, the floorboards scuffed by decades of use. Folding chairs lined the space in uneven rows, and a battered chalkboard leaned against one wall, streaked with faint white markings, and people there were people. Not men in suits. Not criminals in dark coats, women, a dozen, maybe more. They sat hunched in their chairs, coats still on, bags clutched at their sides, as if they were afraid someone might take them away. Their faces carried the wear of long hours, of lives stretched thin. Some had children asleep in their laps. Others twisted their hands nervously, eyes darting to the door when it opened. And at the front, standing tall in the weak glow of a single hanging bulb, Mara Alvarez. Ethan froze. She wasn't hiding in shadows. She wasn't passing envelopes or whispering in code. She was standing before them like a teacher before her class, her bag open on a table beside her, papers stacked in neat piles. Her voice carried gently through the hall, accented but clear. "We begin here," she said, holding up a sheet of paper. "Name, contact, skills. Even if you think you have none, you do. Everyone has something." She handed the sheet to a woman in the front row, who looked at it as if it were made of gold. "Don't write only what you've done," Mara continued, pacing slowly. "Write what you can do, what you are willing to learn. Companies don't only hire experience, they hire promise. You must show them promise." The women nodded, pens scratching across paper. Ethan's chest tightened. He stepped back slightly into the shadow of the doorway, afraid to be seen, his pulse quick. This was not what he expected. This was not what the numbers, the files, the missing documents had told him. For an hour, he watched. He saw Mara move among the women, guiding them, correcting their spelling, encouraging their phrases. She showed them how to structure resumes, how to list experience, how to turn small jobs into statements of skill. "You were not just cleaning," she said firmly to one woman. "You were maintaining. You were supporting. You kept order where there would have been none." The woman blinked at her, tears gathering. Another raised her hand, timid. "But interviews? I don't know what to say. They look at me, and I—" She shook her head. Mara smiled softly. "Then we practice, right now. I ask, you answer. And if you stumble, we try again." Laughter rose, thin at first, then stronger, as the room filled with the sound of women daring to speak of themselves with worth. Ethan leaned against the frame, the wood pressing into his back. His mind spun. This was not theft. This was not espionage. This was giving. And yet, he could not understand it. Why risk her job? Why slip through shadows like a criminal? Why bear the weight of secrecy for something so simple? He thought of the missing files, the irregularities. Were they connected? Were these women somehow involved in the bleeding of his empire? Or was this something else entirely, something the numbers could never explain? For the first time in years, Ethan felt uncertain. He remembered his father's voice. People are either assets or liabilities. But looking at Mara, her tired eyes alive with purpose as she lifted another woman's chin and said, "You are not invisible. He couldn't place her in either column. She was neither. She was both. She was something else. The hall quieted as the lesson drew to a close. The women packed their bags slowly, lingering, as though reluctant to return to the silence waiting outside. Mara handed out second-hand blouses from her bag, folding them neatly for each woman, explaining how to dress for an interview. Not expensive, she said, not new, but clean, pressed, simple. You show them dignity, they will see it. One by one, the women left. Some hugged her. Some whispered, "Thanks." A few wiped their eyes before stepping into the night. When the last had gone, Mara sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping, her hands rubbing at her face. The room that had glowed with her presence now seemed too large for her alone. Ethan almost stepped forward then, almost revealed himself. But he didn't. He stayed in the shadows watching, questions burning in his chest like fire. What was she hiding? What drove her to risk exposure, to risk everything, for this? The old man narrator clears his throat here, voice rasping with memory. And that, he whispers, was the first crack in the armor of Ethan Kessler. For the first time, he saw a life not measured in numbers, not built on ledgers or contracts. He saw a woman giving what little she had, not for profit, not for power, but for the chance that someone else might stand taller tomorrow. And yet still he wondered. What was she hiding behind those tired eyes? Ethan stepped back into the night before Mara could notice him. The door closed quietly behind him, and the sound of the city rushed back in cars growling in the distance. A lone horn blaring, the shuffle of a man pushing a cart down the far end of the street. Yet none of it reached him. His mind was still. Trapped in that dimly lit hall, he leaned against the brick wall, the damp seeping through his coat, and pressed a hand to his chest as though to quiet the chaos there. For years, his life had been built on clarity. Every problem was a puzzle to be solved, every risk a calculation, every person a column entry, asset or liability. That was how he understood the world. That was how he kept control, but what he had just seen refused to fit anywhere on his ledger. Mara Alvarez, quiet, invisible Mara, was no thief, no spy, no rival. She was something infinitely more dangerous to his understanding of the world. She was a giver, and he could not understand why. He walked, his steps slow, his breath fogging in the cold. Each block he passed seemed heavier, as though the city itself pressed its weight onto his shoulders. The women's faces haunted him, tired but hopeful, lined with years of work and want, glowing when Mara told them they mattered. Why risk her job? Why sneak through shadows to teach lessons no one paid her to teach? Why slip stolen hours from the empire of Ethan Kessler just to build something that could never repay her? He could not make sense of it. Suspicion clawed at him still. Perhaps this was all a ruse. Perhaps the resumes were cover, the hall a mask, the kindness a ploy to draw attention from something darker. People did not give freely. Not in his world. Not in the world his father had taught him to see. People are either assets or liabilities. That truth had shaped him. That truth had built him. And now, one woman with a tired face and steady voice threatened to undo it all. He reached the corner of a deserted street and stopped beneath a dead lamppost. The bulb above was broken, leaving him cloaked in shadow. He tilted his head back, staring at the slice of night sky barely visible between the crowded buildings. He thought of his father's study, the leather chair, the ledgers. He thought of his mother's silence at the dinner table. He thought of every deal where he had looked across the table at a man and asked only one question: asset or liability? And then he thought of May, her hands folding clothes for women who had none, her voice urging them to write their names with pride. Her eyes tired, yes, but burning with something he had never seen in the boardrooms of his empire. What column did she belong in? For the first time, he had no answer. The old man's voice breaks here, low and gravelly. You must understand, this was the long struggle. Not the chase through streets, not the pounding of footsteps on wet pavement, but the struggle inside him. The boy who had grown into a king of numbers, faced with a truth he could not calculate. That night, Ethan Kessler began to wrestle not with her, but with himself. Still, suspicion lingered. Ethan could not shake the thought that something else hid behind her eyes. The hall explained much, but not all. The missing files, the odd patterns in his accounts, how did those fit? Why the secrecy, the shadows, the risk? There had to be more. And so the question grew sharper, digging into him like a thorn. What is she hiding? He walked the rest of the night in silence, his shoes splashing through puddles, his coat heavy on his back. He did not return to his penthouse. He did not summon his car. He simply walked, as though the rhythm of his steps might hammer out an answer. But no answer came. Only her voice lingered. You are not invisible. By the time dawn touched the edges of the city, Ethan Kessler knew one thing with certainty. He would follow her again. Not because he wanted to catch her in crime, not because he sought to punish her, but because he had to know the numbers would not rest until they balanced. And Mara Alvarez had tipped his scales. The narrator leans in close, almost whispering. Now, and yet still, he wondered. What was she hiding behind those tired eyes? I've told you about the chase, about the hall, about the moment Ethan Kessler saw the world tilt under his feet. But what I haven't told you is what happened when that tilt became a fall. You see, a man like Ethan doesn't let go of certainty easily. When your life has been built on ledgers and balance sheets, when you've been taught since boyhood that every human soul can be sorted into columns, you cling to that belief like a drowning man clings to a board. And yet, from that night onward, the cracks widened. He couldn't stay away by day. He sat in his tower of glass, staring at reports that no longer gave him comfort. He caught himself drifting, eyes sliding to the security feeds, searching for her shadow moving through the halls with mop and bucket. By night he found himself in his car, driver dismissed, circling the city until the streets grew narrow and the air smelled of rust, waiting for her, Mara Alvarez. The name repeated in his mind like a mantra, like a riddle he could not solve. He followed her 3 nights in a row after the first. Always from a distance, always with care. She never faltered. Always the same route, always the same heavy bag, always the same hall where weary women waited with hope written on their faces. And each night he asked himself the same question. Why? If she wasn't stealing, why sneak? If she wasn't selling, why hide? No answer came. Only her voice echoed. You are not invisible. It was the 4th night when something in him broke. She had finished her lesson, handed out blouses pressed flat, given encouragement like bread to the hungry. One by one, the women left, their footsteps fading. Ethan remained in the shadows, heart pounding, until at last she turned to pack her things. And then he stepped forward. The floor creaked under his polished shoe. She froze. Her head lifted slowly, and for the first time, her eyes found his. They were not afraid. Not even surprised. Only tired. How long? She asked softly. Have you been following me? Ethan's throat worked, but no words came. He was a man whose voice had silenced boardrooms, but under her gaze, he felt like a boy again, caught in some forbidden act. Why? She pressed. Why follow me? Why hide? I could ask you the same, he rasped. She studied him for a long moment, then turned back to her bag. You could have asked me from the beginning, but men like you don't ask, you assume. The words stung more than he cared to admit. At last, he forced himself to speak. The files, the missing documents, what are you doing with them? Her hands paused on the bag. Slowly she drew out a stack of papers and held them up. Old HR training manuals, outdated interview guides, company brochures long since discarded. These? She said. You throw them away, I take them. They still have value guidance, examples, Words these women have never been given. Your trash becomes their hope. Ethan blinked. His empire, bled at the edges, wasn't bleeding at all. What he thought was theft was salvage. What he thought was betrayal was creation. You risk everything. For this? He whispered. For them, she replied. Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. They have no one else. If I am caught, I lose a job. If they are caught by life, they lose everything. Silence hung heavy. Ethan felt the floor tilt again, steeper this time, as though the ground beneath him had turned to water. His father's words thundered in memory. People are either assets or liabilities. Never forget that. But here was a woman who was neither. She was not an asset to his empire. She gave nothing to his profits, his margins, his deals. Nor was she a liability. She did not drain him, did not steal, did not sabotage. She was something else entirely. She was proof that people could not be reduced to numbers. And for Ethan Kessler, that realization was not freedom, it was ruin. Because if his father had been wrong about this, what else had he been wrong about? If people were not assets or liabilities, then what was all his empire built on? He stepped closer. Why hide it then? Why not tell the truth? Mara's tired smile flickered. Because men like you wouldn't believe me, and because the world doesn't reward giving. It punishes it. She slung the strap over her shoulder. You've followed me enough, Mr. Kessler. Now you know. Leave me be. But he couldn't. Not then. Not ever. Because she had cracked him open, and once a man cracks, he cannot be put back together the same way. Now I must pause. Because here's the truth of it. I don't know what words passed between them after that night. I don't know how long they stood in that broken hall, a billionaire and a janitor staring at each other across the ruins of certainty. Some say he offered her money. Some say he walked away in silence. Some even claim he returned, week after week, sitting in the back while she taught. A ghost among the forgotten. What I do know is this. Ethan Kessler was never the same again. He withdrew from deals that promised billions. He walked away from rivals he once would have destroyed. He gave, quietly, secretly, in ways the papers never reported. His empire shifted not outward, but inward. And though the world never knew the reason, I do. Because I was there. Because I saw him chase her down wet streets. Saw him stand frozen in the doorway of that hall. Saw his father's lesson crumble in the face of a single tired woman who chose to give instead of take. And so I tell you this, with all the weight of memory pressing on my bones. That night was not about theft, not about secrets, not about empire. It was about one man, taught all his life to measure value in numbers, discovering a truth he could never unlearn. People are not assets. People are not liabilities. People are the only wealth that matters. The old man's voice breaks into a whisper. And that, my friend, was the night a billionaire learned the true cost of wealth. I've told you about the cracks, haven't I? How Ethan's certainty, built over decades of power, began to fracture the moment he laid eyes on Mara Alvarez's double life. But cracks don't break a wall. Not right away. They spread slowly, thin as hairlines, widening inch by inch, until the whole foundation buckles. And for Ethan, the widening came not with what he saw in the hall, but with what came after. The digging, the following. The restless nights when suspicion warred with fascination, and he could no longer tell whether he sought proof of guilt or proof of something he feared. Even more, proof of goodness. Ethan Kessler was not a man used to doubt. His empire had been built on decisive action. See the weakness, seize it, control it. But with Mara, he could not act, not yet. Instead, he investigated. He called in favors discreetly, voices on the other end of lines too careful to ask questions. He hired men who specialized in shadows, men who could pull apart a life without leaving fingerprints. He told them only her name. Find me everything. And they did. They brought him scraps at first. An address in a neighborhood where the streets leaned inward, where paint peeled from windows and children played with balls gone flat. A record of late rent payments, debts marked unpaid. Then came the deeper truths. Mara Alvarez had once been married. Her husband, a man with sharp charm and sharper fists, had vanished 3 years earlier. No divorce papers filed, no police reports pursued. Just absence, like a candle snuffed in the dark. She was a mother, too. A boy 10 years old, with eyes that teachers described as watchful and older than his years. The child's attendance record was spotless. His grades, middling. His drawings, kept hidden in notebooks, were of houses that looked nothing like the apartment he lived in. And yet, despite the debts, despite the absence, despite the child who needed her, Mara Alvarez spent her nights not patting her own pockets, but lifting others. That was the truth Ethan could not reconcile, because in his world, no one gave without taking. The more he learned, the more he watched. Days bled into nights. His obsession grew teeth. He followed her not only into the broken streets, but also into her workplace. Not openly, no, Ethan Kessler never risked exposure, but through cameras. Through the subtle inquiries of supervisors who did not know they were answering for her life. One evening, long after the last analyst had left, he walked the empty halls of his own building like a stranger. The cleaners had already come and gone, carts abandoned in closets that smelled faintly of bleach. And there, in the corner of a dim supply room, he found it, a drawer, locked, ordinary enough. Every worker had one. But something in its placement, something in the way it seemed almost too ordinary, drew him. He knelt. His fingers brushed the cool metal dot. It would have been easy to force it. He had the keys, the authority, the right. But instead, he hesitated. He felt the hesitation the way one feels the edge of a cliff in the dark. Still, curiosity is a hunger that grows when fed. And Ethan had already tasted too much. The lock yielded with a quiet click. Inside, he did not find files or stolen drives. Not money, not passwords, not evidence of betrayal. He found letters, stacks of them, folded carefully, bound by twine. Notes scribbled on notebook paper, on torn envelopes, on pages ripped from school binders. He unfolded one at random. Thank you, Mara. You saved me. I didn't think I could leave him. But I did. And now my son sleeps without fear. Another. The interview went well. They said my resume was strong. I never thought anyone would look twice at me, but they did. Because of you. Another still. I don't know if I'll ever repay what you gave me, but maybe someday, when I can, I'll help someone too. On and on, letter after letter, each one a piece of a life pulled from the edge. Stories of women clawing out of poverty, of escaping fists, of finding jobs, of learning to believe in themselves because one woman told them they could. The drawer was not a hiding place. It was a shrine. Now here is where I must stop for just a moment, because I do not know how to tell you exactly what Ethan felt as he held those letters. Was it envy? Was it fear? Did he envy the way a woman with nothing could give more than a man with everything? Did he fear the truth that no amount of money, no empire of numbers, could ever purchase the kind of gratitude written in those notes? I do not know. All I know is this. His hands shook. For the first time in decades, Ethan Kessler's hands trembled over something that could not be bought or sold. He closed the drawer quietly, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts inside. He stood in the silence of that supply closet, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. His reflection in the metal door, warped and strange, and in that reflection, perhaps he saw himself not as the world saw him, a titan, a builder, a king, but as he truly was. A man who had measured worth in columns and found himself bankrupt in all that mattered. Or perhaps that is my reflection I am telling you. Not his. You see, memory is a tricky thing. Stories bend. Truth warps in the retelling. And maybe I am no different from Ethan, blurring the lines between what is and what I fear to be true. But I will tell you this, whether envy or fear, something hollowed him that night. And then Ethan uncovered a secret that would tear apart everything he thought he knew about value, about power, about himself. I told you before that cracks don't stay cracks. They spread, they grow. They turn the strongest walls into rubble. For Ethan Kessler, the rubble came the night he stopped hiding in shadows and stepped into the light of that community hall. It was inevitable. Obsession always ends in confrontation. Hall looked the same as it always had. The folding chairs, the chalkboard scarred with chalk ghosts, the women clutching pens and papers like lifelines. And Mara with her bag, her weary face, her hands steady as she guided them. But this time, Ethan didn't linger in the doorway. He didn't hide in the shadows. He walked forward. The sound of his shoes echoed against the wooden floor. Heads turned. Conversations stilled. A dozen pairs of eyes blinked at him, uncertain, afraid, defiant. And then Mira's eyes found his. She froze. The air between them thickened, charged, like a storm about to break. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Ethan's jaw clenched. "I've watched you long enough. I know what you've been taking. What you've been hiding." The women shifted uneasily. One of them whispered, "Taking?" Another clutched her child closer. Mara straightened. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut sharper than any boardroom barb he'd ever known. "Taking? You think this is theft? You've stolen files. You've hidden letters. I've saved lives," she snapped, the words like lightning splitting the room. "Not everything worth keeping has a price tag, Mr. Kessler." The women's eyes widened. Some nodded. Some held their breath. Ethan felt the weight of their gazes pressing on him like a jury waiting to deliver its verdict. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He reached for the language he knew: numbers, value, risk, return. But here, in this battered hall, the numbers turned to ash. The truth hit him, sudden and merciless. The files weren't missing. The data wasn't stolen. The anomalies, the ghosts in his empire, they weren't hers. They were his. His blindness, his arrogance, his refusal to see the humanity in the people who scrubbed at his floors and carried his world on their shoulders. The true crime wasn't hers. It was his. Decades of reducing people to assets and liabilities, of measuring worth in columns, of dismissing lives that didn't shine on balance sheets. That was the theft. That was the betrayal. And standing before him, Mira Alvarez, tired, worn, unyielding, was proof of it. The hall was silent. Ethan felt the walls closing in. Every woman there watched him, waiting, not with fear, not with deference, with expectation. He realized then that he was standing in a kind of trial. No marble courthouse, no jury box. Just a cracked floor and battered chairs, and women who had survived too much to flinch now. And Mara at the center, like a judge who didn't need a gavel. "You have a choice," she said simply. His breath caught. "You can destroy this." She continued, "You can call it theft. You can fire me. You can shut these doors and scatter these women back into the dark." Her voice softened, but the steel in it did not bend. "Or you can help us. Not with charity, not with pity, with belief, with support. With the kind of power only men like you hold, but never use." The words struck harder than any accusation, because she was right. The empire he had built was vast, but empty. Here, in this forgotten hall, stood something small but real. Something that mattered. His legacy. Would it be the cold marble of boardrooms, or the living, breathing defiance of these women? One by one, the women rose from their chairs. Slowly at first, then together, until the hall filled with faces. Faces lined with hardship. Faces marked by survival. Faces lit with something fiercer than hope. Defiance. They surrounded him, not with fists or threats, but with presence. With the undeniable weight of lives he had once dismissed as liabilities. The air crackled. Ethan felt himself shrink and swell all at once. For the first time in decades, he wasn't the richest man in the room. He was the poorest. This was not a boardroom. This was judgment, and he, Ethan Kessler, stood at the center of it. The old man's voice lowers now, gravel thick with memory. And there, surrounded by the very souls he once called liabilities, Ethan Kessler chose his reckoning. The voice falters. A pause hangs heavy. But what choice he made? That, my friend, is a truth only he and the women of that hall will ever truly know. They say endings are tidy things, wrapped in bows, signed with finality. But that is a lie told to comfort us. Real endings are quieter, slower, unfolding like dusk, one light fading, another flickering the life dot. So it was with Ethan Kessler. He did not shutter the hall. He did not fire Mara Alvarez. He did not scatter those women back into silence. Instead, he sat among them. At first a stranger, stiff in his tailored suit, the gleam of wealth clashing with the worn wood and second-hand coats. But slowly, the suit gave way. He loosened the collar. He set aside the ledger in his mind. He listened, and then he learned. He asked questions not about markets, but about lives. He practiced interview answers alongside women who trembled at the thought of speaking. He folded shirts and pressed blouses, awkward at first, then with clumsy devotion. It was not charity, not pity, it was something rarer. Humility. Of course, the money came too. Empires cannot help but flow where their masters point them. Funds poured quietly into the program. The hall became 2 halls, then 5, then 10. Cities whispered of places where women could walk in with nothing but fear and walk out carrying dignity like a lantern. But ask anyone who was there, and they will not tell you about the money. They will tell you about Ethan himself, about Big Jofen. Nights he came, not as a CEO, but as a man. About the way he sat with Mara's son, showing him chess moves, listening to his drawings explained in a rush of shy words. About how that boy grew up seeing not a billionaire, but a flawed man really trying to listen. Now I must confess something. People often ask me why I tell this story. Why a man like Ethan matters when the world is crowded with men who never change. And my answer is always the same. Because once in a while, someone does. The old man sighs here, voice low, gravel caught in his throat. In the end, Ethan Kessler didn't find stolen data. He found something far rarer: stolen time, stolen dignity returned by the hands of a woman who had nothing and gave everything. The tale closes not with applause, not with headlines, but with a whisper. So tell me, my friend. The narrator leans close, his breath heavy with age. What's the real measure of a man? His wealth? Or the lives he leaves brighter behind him? And then silence, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for answers, the kind that lingers. You want to hold an audience, do you? You want them to sit through the storm, through the silence, through every turn of the story until the very last whisper fades? Then you need more than plot. You need the tools of survival. I've seen men with gold in their hands lose listeners in a breath. And I've seen paupers with nothing but a pause capture a room so tight, no one dared move. Let me tell you how. Chapter, a scene, even a single line must never close like a door. It must creak half open, promising shadows on the other side. That's a cliffhanger. At the end of each chapter. You leave them leaning forward, not back. Give them a twist, a question, a secret half unveiled. Make them whisper to themselves, I can't stop now. I need to know what's next. Listen carefully. The prologue ends not with a revelation, but a whisper. And what he found at the end of that road, well, it was nothing like what he expected. Chapter 1 ends with a shiver of prophecy. That lesson, carved into his bones, will be shattered soon. The middle swells with suspicion, yet still he wondered. What was she hiding behind those tired eyes? And the climax hangs like a blade, and there, surrounded by the very souls he once called liabilities, Ethan Kessler chose. His reckoning, do you hear it? None of those endings rest. They pull, they drag. They force the listener's mind forward. That's the power of cliffhangers. They are not endings. They are beginnings wearing a mask, but a story cannot live on. Forward pull alone. No, you must weave threads backward too. Remind them where they've been. Make them feel clever for remembering. That's where callbacks live. In Ethan's tale, there was always the father's voice. Cold, sharp, absolute. People are either assets or liabilities. Never forget that. You hear it first as a child's memory. Then you hear it in the paranoia of a man chasing shadows. You hear it again in the locked drawer, in the confrontation, in the hall filled with women. And at last you hear it shatter, as the truth falls heavy on him, that people cannot be measured in columns, that a life is not a number, that repetition is not redundancy, it is rhythm. Callbacks are the echo in the canyon. They remind the listener that the story has bones, a spine, a heartbeat that began long before the present scene. And when the echo changes, when the phrase that once rang like iron crumbles into dust, the audience feels the weight of transformation. Now, here's the secret most storytellers forget. Silence speaks louder than words. The old man narrator, you hear his gravel, his breath, the rasp between sentences. Those are not accidents. Those are pauses. Listen. Funny thing, isn't it? Do you hear it? Or perhaps that is my reflection I am telling you, not his. So tell me, my friend, what's the real measure of a man? Those breaks are retention weapons. They reset the ear. They catch drifting attention. They pull the listener close, like a confidant being told a secret in the dark. The pause is a door. It lets the audience step inside the story, instead of watching from the street. But none of this matters if the rhythm fails. A man can't live on thunder alone, nor on whispers. The heart must beat fast, slow, fast again. Suspense and reflection. Action and stillness. That's balance. Think of Ethan's journey. Suspense. The tale through wet streets. The heavy bag. The locked drawer. Reflection. The cold father at dinner. The boy's loneliness. The old man's sighs. Suspense. The confrontation. The circle of women. The reckoning. Reflection. The aftermath. The epilogue. The question that lingers. Each feeds the other. Without suspense, reflection drowns in calm. Without reflection, suspense exhausts the heart. Together, they create a wave pulling the audience up, letting them breathe, then dragging them under again. That wave is what keeps them until the final word. So, remember this. Cliffhangers drag them forward. Callbacks draw them back. Pauses pull them close. Balance carries them through. Use them not as tricks, but as truths. Build them into the bones of the tale. Make the listener lean, remember, hush, and breathe. And when the final line falls, whisper, fading. So tell me, my friend, what's the real measure of a man? His wealth? Or the lives he leaves brighter behind him?